2 hours. That is how close the United States and Canada came to a 50% tariff wall going up at midnight. And 2 hours before it hit, Donald Trump blinked first. Not Canada, Trump. After weeks of insisting he did not care whether a deal ever got done, the President of the United States picked up the phone, paused his own tariffs, and announced on social media that the two countries had a deal, subject to finalizing the paperwork. If you have been following this trade war for the past year, you already know how rare that sentence is. This is the story of how it happened, and it is a story about leverage nobody in Washington thought Canada actually had. If stories like this one, where the official headline and the real financial story underneath it are two completely different things, are your kind of thing, hit subscribe now, because we are about to walk through exactly how this standoff got resolved, what it actually cost each side, and why the outcome matters far more than a single tariff deadline. Let's rebuild the timeline properly, because the last month has moved fast enough that most people only caught fragments of it. On July 20th, 2026, Trump signed 3 separate presidential proclamations invoking Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, a Depression-era statute so old and so rarely used that the last time any president applied it to impose an actual tariff was 1949. 77 years of silence broken in a single afternoon. The reason he reached for something that obscure traces back to February 20th, 2026, when the Supreme Court struck down the tariff authority Trump had leaned on more than any other tool of his second term, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. That ruling gutted his ability to impose sweeping tariffs by presidential proclamation alone, so his legal team went searching through the statute books for a replacement that needed no investigation, no national security finding, and no congressional vote. Section 338 fit perfectly, because it asks for almost nothing except a presidential signature and a discrimination finding. The 3 July 20th proclamations targeted Canadian dairy, alcohol, and motor vehicles specifically, citing what the administration called discriminatory treatment of American products in those sectors. But the actual coverage stretched far beyond those 3 categories. The tariff lists reached into electronics, furniture, lumber, cement, clothing, footwear, cosmetics, toys, and yes, hockey sticks, ultimately touching somewhere between $20 and $28 billion worth of Canadian goods, depending on which version of the list you were reading that week. And crucially, these tariffs were built to apply regardless of whether a product qualified for duty-free treatment under the existing Continental Trade Agreement. That detail alone is what turned this from an ordinary trade dispute into something structurally different. A Canadian-made product that had been shielded from tariffs for years under that agreement would still get hit with the full 50% the moment Section 338 took effect. The clock on that 50% was set for August 19th, 2026, and it landed at the worst possible moment for the broader relationship. Because 11 days earlier, on July 1st, the United States Trade Representative had already announced that Washington would not agree to extend the underlying Continental Trade Agreement in its current form. That agreement, which shields close to 90% of Canadian exports from broader American tariffs, was due for a mandatory 6-year review, and instead of locking in another 16 years of certainty, the review opened an undefined, open-ended renegotiation window with no fixed endpoint. So by the 3rd week of July, Canada was staring at 2 separate threats simultaneously: a Depression-era tariff hammer aimed directly at its exporters, and the erosion of the very framework that had protected the bulk of its trade for 6 years running. Most governments in that position spend the following weeks issuing statements. Canada spent them negotiating with unusual discipline, and it is worth walking through exactly what that negotiation looked like, because the restraint itself became part of the leverage. Prime Minister Mark Carney was asked directly, at a meeting of Canada's provincial premiers in Charlottetown in late July, what retaliation Canada was actually considering. He declined to name a single specific measure, arguing publicly that spelling out a response in advance while talks were still live would only weaken the country's negotiating position. That is not the language of a leader stalling for time. It is the calculated patience of someone who used to run 2 of the world's most consequential central banks and understands exactly how escalation mechanics work. Through the first 3 weeks of August, Canada's Trade Minister, Dominic LeBlanc, and the country's chief trade negotiator, Janice Charette, made repeated trips to Washington, meeting with United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer in sessions that grew more frequent as the deadline approached. On August 12th, the 2 sides held their 3rd meeting in as many weeks. LeBlanc described the atmosphere afterward in careful, almost clinical terms, saying only that Canada remained committed to defending its interests at the table. By the weekend of August 15th and 16th, LeBlanc and Charette were spending entire weekends in Washington, and on Sunday the 16th, they held a full hour-long virtual session with Greer that a spokesperson described as constructive without offering a single additional detail. On Monday the 17th, Carney himself described the state of talks to reporters as very intense and delicate, and explicitly declined to say more, telling reporters plainly that this was not the time to negotiate in public. That same day, Trump made the first concrete move. He announced he was pausing the 50% tariffs that were set to take effect at midnight on the 19th, buying both sides 3 additional days. Behind that pause sat a genuine, if grudging, admission from Washington. The executive declaration delaying the duties, signed by Trump personally, stated that Canada had expressed a commitment to remove the discriminations the tariffs were meant to punish. Read that sentence carefully, because it is Washington's own legal language conceding that this was never really about a fixed, unappeasable grievance. It was about specific, negotiable irritants, and Canada was signaling it would move on them. Here's what those irritants actually were, because they matter for understanding what Canada gave up and what it held on to. The United States wanted 3 things above everything else. It wanted the provincial bans on American alcohol lifted, bans that 8 of Canada's 10 provinces had maintained since early 2025 in direct retaliation for the original wave of tariffs. It wanted greater access for American dairy producers inside Canada's supply management system, the decades-old quota structure that caps how much foreign dairy can enter the Canadian market before steep tariffs kick in. And it wanted Canada to drop its own retaliatory tariffs on American-built vehicles, tariffs Ottawa had imposed as a mirrored response to earlier American duties on Canadian steel and aluminum. In exchange, the emerging deal offered Canada something it had been formally requesting for well over a year: meaningful relief on the broader Section 232 tariffs still sitting on steel, aluminum, lumber, and autos, tariffs that predate this summer's crisis entirely and had already been squeezing Canadian exporters since early 2025. Sources close to the talks described the shape of that relief in specific terms. Auto tariffs would drop from 25% down to somewhere around 15%, with an exemption preserved for the value of American-made content already built into vehicles assembled in Canada. Steel would move to a tariff rate quota system, with duties in the 10 to 15% range inside the quota and far higher rates outside it. Aluminum would follow a similar quota structure with single-digit tariffs inside the line. Compare that to where those 2 metals had been sitting, at a flat 50%, and the scale of the requested relief becomes obvious. Softwood lumber turned out to be the single hardest sticking point in the entire negotiation, and it is worth understanding why, because it captures the regional fault lines running underneath this deal better than almost any other detail. British Columbia's Premier, David Abey, said publicly in late July that he would not allow American alcohol back onto provincial shelves unless lumber tariffs came down meaningfully, framing anything less as selling out forest families for nothing. The stakes behind that statement are not abstract. Industry executives testified that Canadian lumber producers were paying combined tariffs and duties as high as 45%, a burden one lumber company executive described as devastating, adding that roughly half of British Columbia's lumber manufacturing capacity had already been forced to shut down under that pressure. Quebec, meanwhile, was almost entirely focused on protecting its dairy supply management system rather than lumber. Ontario's Premier was locked in on the auto sector specifically, given how deeply Windsor and the broader southern Ontario manufacturing belt sit inside cross-border vehicle supply chains. Carney was not just negotiating with Washington. He was simultaneously negotiating with his own provinces, each one holding a veto over pieces of whatever final deal he brought home, and that internal complexity is precisely why he refused to preview his position publicly for weeks. By Tuesday, August 18th, negotiators believed they had landed on a framework that could break the impasse, but the fate of that framework rested entirely on one final phone call between Carney and Trump. That call happened Tuesday afternoon. Hours later, just before the 50% tariffs were due to take effect at 1 minute past midnight, Trump posted that he was pausing them for 3 additional days through the end of the day on Friday, August 21st, declaring on social media that Canada and the United States, subject to finalizing documents, had reached a deal. Carney confirmed shortly afterward that the postponement would run through that Friday, describing the draft agreement as one that builds on Canada's top bilateral trade terms and reinforces what he called that Canadian advantage. Notice the phrasing, not relief, advantage. Trump, for his part, went further in his own public remarks the next morning, telling reporters the new arrangement would mean no tariffs at all going into Canada for American farmers and businesses, adding that tariffs would be, in his words, non-existent for American agricultural exporters heading north. He framed it as Canada finally agreeing to drop the tremendous tariffs he claimed had been charging American businesses for years. Whatever the final framing turns out to be once the text is actually signed, the practical reality by midweek was unmistakable. The most aggressive tariff tool Washington had deployed against a G7 ally in nearly 80 years had been paused, not because Canada folded, but because both sides needed something the other one was holding. And this is where the story stops being just about one deadline and starts being about the leverage Canada had actually built over the previous 18 months, most of it far away from the negotiating table in Washington entirely. Here's the detail. Almost nobody outside trade circles noticed when the White House first published its fact sheet on the July 20th tariffs. Section 338 explicitly excluded 3 categories from coverage: energy, potash, and critical minerals. Not as an afterthought, as a deliberate carve-out built into the proclamation from day one. Canadian crude oil supplies a majority share of everything American refineries process, particularly across the Midwest, where facilities have been engineered for decades, specifically around Canadian heavy crude, and cannot simply switch suppliers without billions of dollars in retrofits. Canadian potash underpins the fertilizer American farmers depend on to grow corn, wheat, and soybeans at scale, since the United States imports the overwhelming majority of the potash it consumes, and Canada alone supplies the largest share of that total. And Canada ranks among the world's leading suppliers of critical minerals like uranium and niobium, materials the American electric vehicle and defense industries need as they try to cut their own dependence on China. Washington exempted exactly the categories where Canada actually holds structural leverage over the American economy, and tariffed almost everything else. That is not the posture of a country negotiating from a position of total strength. It is the posture of a country that knew precisely which levers it could not afford to pull. And Ottawa's negotiators walked into every single meeting this summer with that asymmetry sitting quietly in the background. Layer onto that the diversification work Canada had already been doing for over a year before this deadline ever arrived, and the full picture becomes clear. While this specific tariff fight was unfolding, Canada had already signed a free trade agreement with Ecuador and concluded a comprehensive economic partnership with the United Arab Emirates. Both closed on the same day in late July, alongside a UAE investment pledge reportedly worth as much as $70 billion. It had already finalized enhancements to its trade agreement with the European Union, reached a preliminary agreement with China that slashed tariffs on Canadian canola from roughly 85% down near 15%, and set a formal national target to double its non-American exports to $600 billion by 2035. Backed by a $100 billion expansion of the Port of Vancouver, already moving through federal approval. None of that required Washington's permission, and all of it meant that by the time Trump's 50% tariff deadline actually arrived, Canada was not walking into that negotiation as a country with nowhere else to sell what it produces. It was walking in as a country that had already proven in signed contracts that it had somewhere else to go if the deal on the table wasn't good enough. Put a number on that diversification push, and the picture sharpens even further. Canada's non-American exports currently sit somewhere around $300 billion annually, and Prime Minister Carney has been explicit that the country's decades-long process of building an ever closer economic relationship with the United States is now over, a line he has repeated to Canadians directly rather than leaving buried in a policy paper. To back that statement with something more than rhetoric, Carney logged more than 24 foreign trips in his first year in office alone, an extraordinary diplomatic pace for the leader of a country that had rarely needed to look far beyond its southern neighbor for economic partnerships throughout most of its modern history. Nearly every one of those trips produced either a signed agreement, a concluded negotiation, or a formally launched framework, and Canadian officials say the government has signed more than 20 new trade and security partnerships since this diversification push accelerated. That is not a country hedging its bets quietly in the background. That is a government that identified a structural risk years before this summer's tariff fight and had an entire alternative architecture ready to lean on the moment it actually needed one. The infrastructure side of that strategy matters just as much as the paperwork, because ports and pipelines take years to build and cannot simply be conjured into existence once a crisis is already underway. The Port of Vancouver already moves roughly $1 billion in goods every single day and connects Canada to 170 markets worldwide, handling around 40% of everything the country trades outside North America. The federal government formally referred its planned expansion, a project expected to add nearly 50% more container capacity and unlock that $100 billion in additional annual trade capacity, into its national major projects review process in mid-July, just days before the Section 338 tariffs were even signed. That timing is not a coincidence worth glossing over. It tells you the infrastructure commitments underpinning Canada's diversification strategy were already moving through the machinery of government well before this particular tariff crisis forced anyone's hand, which is exactly why Ottawa could credibly point to alternatives at the negotiating table rather than simply talking about them in the abstract. None of this diversification, it is worth being honest about, changes the core arithmetic of the relationship overnight. Canada still sends roughly 3/4 of its total goods exports to the United States, a concentration that will not meaningfully shift within a single negotiating cycle, no matter how many new agreements get signed in Toronto or Ottawa. The auto sector, the energy sector, and vast stretches of Canadian manufacturing remain deeply structurally woven into American supply chains in ways that cannot simply be rerouted toward the Gulf or the Indo-Pacific on short notice. But structural dependence and total helplessness are two very different things. And this August is the clearest evidence yet of that distinction actually mattering at the negotiating table, rather than staying confined to economic theory. The diversification did not need to replace the American relationship to change the negotiation. It only needed to be real enough and visible enough to make Washington's core assumption that Canada had nowhere else to turn, no longer something either side could take for granted. That is the leverage Trump's own rhetoric never seemed to fully account for. In late June, he told reporters flatly that the United States does not need anything Canada has and does not need anything Mexico has. Weeks later, at a General Motors plant in Michigan in late July, he repeated the sentiment even more bluntly, saying Canada needs America, not the other way around. Both comments landed in the same window Canadian officials were quietly closing international agreements that had nothing to do with the United States at all. The assumption behind Trump's position was that Canada's roughly three-quarters dependence on American export markets made Ottawa structurally unable to hold out. That assumption is precisely what got tested this August. In the three-day pause, the concessions on steel and aluminum and autos, and Trump's own public claim of a very fair deal suggest the assumption did not hold up the way Washington expected it to. There is a political cost sitting on both sides of this outcome that is worth naming plainly, because neither government walks away from this looking simply victorious. Carney has spent the better part of a year telling Canadians he would not sign a bad deal, and the public mood inside Canada has remained firmly against further concessions to Washington for months. Any agreement that includes Canada lifting its alcohol bans and dropping its auto tariffs is going to draw immediate criticism from voters who backed Carney specifically because he promised to stand firm. On the American side, Trump is handing back tariff relief on steel, aluminum, lumber, and autos that his own administration spent over a year building up his leverage. And industry voices inside the United States have already flagged that even a cut from 25 to 15% on Canadian auto tariffs threatens to squeeze domestic manufacturers who had priced in the higher rate. Both leaders are walking a political tightrope, and the version of this deal that eventually gets signed and published in full will be picked apart by critics in both countries the moment the ink dries. Still, look at what actually happened in the final 72 hours, because it tells you more about where the real power sat than either side's talking points do. Trump extended the deadline once, then extended it a second time when Tuesday's call ran long, holding the tariff threat exactly at the edge without ever actually letting it detonate. Every extension is itself a signal, because a president who genuinely did not care whether a deal happened, as Trump repeatedly claimed in public throughout July, does not keep pushing his own deadline back by 72 hours at a time. Somewhere in that repeated postponement is an acknowledgement that the cost of actually letting 50% tariffs hit $20 to $28 billion of cross-border trade, in an economy where auto parts and lumber and dairy inputs crossed the border multiple times before becoming a finished product, was higher for the United States than the political theater of the deadline suggested. Consider what a full 50% duty landing on that trade would have actually meant in practical terms for American businesses and consumers, not just Canadian exporters. Section 232 tariffs, already sitting on steel, aluminum, and lumber, were layered on top of these new Section 338 duties, meaning some product categories were staring down cumulative tariff burdens well past 70% before this deal came together. No importer absorbs that kind of cost shock without passing it straight to the buyer. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce's own chief executive said plainly in the days before the deadline that businesses on both sides had spent well over a year in a kind of high-wire act, holding off on hiring and investment decisions simply because they could not predict what the rules would look like from one month to the next. That uncertainty itself is a cost financial markets price in long before a single additional tariff dollar changes hands. And it is a cost that fell on American businesses buying Canadian lumber and auto parts every bit as much as it fell on Canadian exporters trying to sell them. There's a useful historical parallel sitting underneath this entire episode, and it is the same one legal scholars kept returning to the moment Section 338 was announced back in July. The statute Trump revived comes from the exact same 1930 legislative package that produced Smoot-Hawley, the tariff law so catastrophic it is widely blamed for deepening the Great Depression by collapsing global trade by roughly two-thirds between 1929 and 1934. Over 1,000 economists signed a public petition at the time begging President Hoover not to sign it. He signed it anyway, and American exporters felt the consequences almost immediately, with American exports to Europe falling by more than 60% within a few years as retaliation multiplied across the world. The structural logic has not changed in 96 years. Tariffs built to pressure a trading partner tend to create real, measurable damage inside the country imposing them, And that damage becomes politically harder to manage when the targeted country refuses to escalate loudly and instead lets the economic cost of the standoff speak for itself. Canada's posture through most of this summer, quiet negotiation paired with visible diversification elsewhere, is almost the textbook opposite of how retaliation played out in 1930, and it appears to have produced a very different result. It's worth sitting with the actual dollar figures on both sides of this dispute for a moment, because the abstractions can hide just how large the numbers involved really are. Total goods and services trade between the two countries runs close to $900 billion a year, one of the two largest bilateral trade relationships on the entire planet. 36 individual American states count Canada as their single largest export market, more than what American businesses sell combined to the United Kingdom, France, China, and Japan. That is not a Canadian talking point. That figure comes directly from official American congressional research, and it explains why the political pressure inside this standoff never stayed confined to trade ministries in Ottawa and Washington. When a trade relationship threaded that deeply through 36 state economies starts to fray, senators and governors feel it long before any court ruling or WTO panel gets involved, and that pressure flows straight back into whichever administration is holding the tariff pen. The auto sector alone illustrates how tangled this relationship actually is at the ground level. American vehicle exports to Canada had already fallen by more than $5.5 billion over the preceding year, a drop of roughly 22%, a decline the White House itself repeatedly cited while justifying tougher tariffs in the first place. But Canada did not simply stop buying vehicles during that stretch. It redirected that spending toward Mexico, Japan, South Korea, and Germany instead, whose combined share of the Canadian auto market rose sharply over the same period. Every dollar Canada stopped spending on American-built cars went somewhere else entirely. And once new supplier relationships like that settle in, they rarely snap back to where they started, deal or no deal. That is the quiet, compounding cost sitting behind every month this standoff dragged on, and it is a cost American manufacturers were absorbing every bit as much as Canadian exporters were. Lumber tells an even sharper version of the same story. Industry executives testified publicly that Canadian softwood producers were facing combined tariffs and duties as high as 45% through the worst stretch of this dispute, a burden one lumber company president described bluntly as devastating, adding that roughly half of British Columbia's entire lumber manufacturing capacity had already been forced offline. Those are not abstract percentages sitting in a trade ministry spreadsheet. Those are mills that stopped running and workers who stopped getting shifts in a province that anchors a meaningful share of Canada's entire non-American trade strategy through the Port of Vancouver, sitting right on its coastline. The reason British Columbia's premier drew such a hard line on lumber relief before agreeing to lift alcohol restrictions is precisely because that province had already absorbed more damage from this standoff than almost any other part of the country, and its leadership was not willing to hand over a concession without getting something concrete in return. There's also a currency and investment dimension to this standoff that professional traders have been watching far more closely than the daily headlines suggest. Persistent uncertainty over whether the broader continental trade framework survives in anything like its current form has already shown up in how global capital prices, Canadian risk, and business investment decisions on both sides of the border slowed noticeably through the summer as companies waited to see whether the rules governing cross-border manufacturing were about to be rewritten by a court case, a proclamation, or an entirely new negotiated framework. Every multinational company evaluating a new North American manufacturing investment this year has been watching this legal and diplomatic situation unfold in real time, because if a sitting trade agreement can be unilaterally overridden by a statute written in 1930, the entire investment thesis behind building a factory inside that agreement's protections starts to look considerably less certain than it did 2 years ago. That uncertainty is a cost that never appears on any tariff schedule, but it shows up eventually in slower hiring, delayed expansion plans, and softer regional growth on both sides of the border. And it is exactly the kind of cost that gives both governments a genuine incentive to close a deal rather than let a deadline lapse indefinitely. There is also a legal current running underneath all of this that never fully went away, even with a deal on the table. Multiple trade law scholars have argued for weeks that Section 338 may not even survive a serious federal court challenge, on the grounds that it was effectively superseded by later trade legislation passed in 1962 and again in 1974. The same Supreme Court that struck down the administration's emergency powers tariffs back in February used reasoning that could apply just as easily to this 96-year-old statute, holding that broad unilateral presidential tariff authority requires clear congressional backing to survive judicial review. Canada had already signaled it intended to pursue exactly that kind of challenge, both through domestic courts and through formal World Trade Organization dispute channels, running in parallel with the diplomatic negotiations the entire time. Every day that passed without a finalized deal was, in a real sense, another day that legal exposure kept building quietly in the background, adding pressure to close an agreement before a court ever had the chance to rule on whether the underlying tariff authority was valid in the first place. So where does this actually leave things as the ink dries on whatever framework emerges from Friday's deadline? The immediate outcome is a tariff wall that did not go up, at least not yet, and a set of trade concessions that will lower some of the oldest, most persistent irritants in the entire Canada-United States relationship, from steel and aluminum duties that have squeezed manufacturers for well over a year, to a softwood lumber dispute that stretches back decades before this current fight even began. But the deeper outcome is what this entire episode revealed about how much the underlying balance of power in this relationship has actually shifted. A Depression-era law revived specifically because it required no congressional approval and no formal process, ended up getting walked back through exactly the kind of old-fashioned, patient, multi-front diplomatic pressure that no single statute can override, energy and potash and critical minerals sitting untouched in the background the entire time, a diversification strategy already producing signed contracts with the rest of the world, and a negotiating team that refused to preview its hand in public, no matter how hard critics on both sides pushed it to. Whether this settles into a durable signed agreement by the end of the week, or slips into yet another extension while the hardest details around lumber and dairy get hammered out, one thing about this standoff is already clear and will not change no matter how the final text reads. The country that was supposed to have no leverage in this relationship spent the last month proving, deadline after deadline, that it had more of it than almost anyone in Washington assumed going in. If this breakdown helped you see how this entire month actually unfolded behind the headlines, hit subscribe so you catch the moment the final deal text gets published. Share this with anyone who thinks this was just a fight over hockey sticks and dairy quotas, and drop a comment telling us whether you think this framework holds past Friday, or whether we are all back here again in 3 weeks watching another deadline get pushed to the wire.